If your goal is to play jazz with other musicians, then you're gonna need to know some jazz standards. But there are actually a number of styles of jazz within jazz repertoire you need to be aware of. So let's talk about these 7 categories of jazz standards that you need to know. Let's do it. If you were to go to a public jazz jam session, or perhaps you get a gig, you're gonna wanna know a variety of different kinds of jazz standards within different subgenres of jazz. Otherwise, you're gonna find yourself not knowing a lot of tunes or just not being able to play with other jazz musicians. So, category number 1 is the blues. So the blues undeniably is one of the most important song forms in jazz, and really jazz kind of sprung out of the blues. And so consequently, a lot of the language in jazz is coming from the blues. So the 12-bar blues is important to know, especially because there's also a lot of jazz heads, or as we call them, melodies, that are based off of the blues. So you're gonna wanna know quite a few blueses within this category, but 3 that are good to consider learning would be Tenor Madness by Sonny Rollins. There's also Things Ain't What They Used to Be. And then for one that's actually in a more interesting key, the key of E flat, you could learn Sandu by Clifford Brown. Category 2 is rhythm changes. Rhythm changes is the second most important song form in jazz, and it's called rhythm changes because it's based off of the jazz standard I Got Rhythm by George Gershwin, hence rhythm changes. And essentially what jazz musicians have done, especially bebop jazz musicians, is played different heads, or again, melodies, over top of these exact same chord changes. By the way, we also call this a contrafact, taking existing chord changes of a song and adding a new melody over top of it. So because there are so many different jazz melodies over top of these chord changes, it's important to know it. Particularly, you want to know it in the key of concert B flat, because this is the common key for rhythm changes. Whereas the blues, you may want to learn it even in all 12 keys because there's a lot of different common keys. An easy one you could learn is Lester Leaps In by Lester Young. A slightly more complicated, however really common jam session tune is Oleo by Sonny Rollins. And perhaps an even more complicated but great bebop melody to learn would be Anthropology by Charlie Parker. So make sure you know some of these rhythm changes heads to get you through jam sessions and gigs. Category number 3 is Great American Songbook. Great American Songbook is probably the top category that you want to learn songs in because they make up quite a few jazz standards in the repertoire. In general, Great American Songbook tunes consist of songs from old films and old Broadway shows. But also oftentimes lumped into that is some of the classic jazz composers like Duke Ellington. So a lot of his compositions are also considered Great American Songbook. Essentially classics from the 20s and 30s. So some examples would be All the Things You Are, or All of Me, or It Could Happen to You. If you hear Frank Sinatra singing it, it's probably a Great American Songbook tune. So make sure you know a good number of these, perhaps more than all the rest of the categories, because they're gonna be really important for you when you go to play at jam sessions or with other people. Now, by the way, if you need help learning jazz standards, get a step-by-step process so that you don't forget them or that you don't get lost in the song form or confused. I have a simple free guide to make that super easy. It's called Learn Jazz Standards the Smart Way. You can find that in the description down below. Sign up for it completely free. Category 4 is bebop. So the bebop era came about in the 1940s, and that was primarily pioneered by Charlie Parker and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. And really this is the moment where jazz kind of ceased to be like danceable swing music and more into virtuosic music that was intended for musicians. And so what you find is a lot of the bebop heads are essentially solos that have been compressed into theme and variation, and very angular and sometimes a little bit complicated. That being said, they're great tools for learning how to play jazz language because essentially when you learn a bebop melody, you are learning a jazz solo. And yes, there are commonly called jam session tunes that are bebop heads, so they are important to know. Some to consider learning would be Billy's Bounce, which is actually a blues head, so you can kill two birds with one stone by learning a blues as well as a bebop head. Another good one to learn is Scrapple from the Apple by Charlie Parker, which is basically a contrafact of Honeysuckle Rose. And then perhaps if you want to challenge, one of the most complicated bebop heads to play would be Confirmation by Charlie Parker. So know just a handful of these melodies to make sure you're covered on this bass. Category number 5 is modal jazz standards. Modal tunes kind of became popular or innovated by Miles Davis, among others. But of course, when we think of modal music, we really do think of Miles Davis and like his composition, So What? But also John Coltrane did another one called Impressions. Impressions is literally just the same chord changes as So What, except for with a different melody. Now, when we talk about modal music, we're talking about song forms that are based off of the modes of usually the major scale. So for example, So What is in D Dorian, which Dorian is the second mode of a major scale. So really we're in the key of C major, and we're not necessarily playing functional harmony with 2-5-1 chord progressions and things with a tonal center necessarily. We are really just basing our improvisation off of the modes. Because this is such an important style within jazz, and yes, there are common jam session tunes that are modal, you definitely want to know a few. And some of them would be, like I mentioned, So What, Impressions, and perhaps even Miles Davis's Milestones. Category number 6 is Bossa Nova. Bossa Novas are where Brazilian music meets jazz, and the style of Bossa Nova, which of course comes out of Brazil, became a really big part of the repertoire within jazz. So you really can't get away with not knowing how to play Bossa Nova and not knowing some of the songs. Now, the primary composer of Bossa Novas that became jazz standards are by Antonio Carlos Jobim. So the most classic and obvious one is The Girl from Ipanema, which 100% if you ever play a gig, someone will probably come up from the bar and ask you to play it. But also other tunes like Wave or Corcovado or Triste are good ones to learn. But then of course there's Bossa Nova tunes that aren't by Brazilian composers at all. For example, Blue Bossa by Kenny Dorham is probably one of the most classic Bossa Nova jam session tunes, so you're gonna wanna know that one for sure. Category number 7 is ballads. Perhaps in my opinion, the best ballads in the world come from the genre of jazz. And so ballads are really an important part of any jazz set. And so it's really important that you know quite a few ballads. Now, jazz ballads are known for their rich harmony, the lots of chords moving by, but mostly the really, really beautiful and intimate melodies. So it can be a lot of fun to really figure out how to express these melodies and these ballads in your own personal way. And that's one of the magics of jazz. A few jazz ballads definitely worth learning, for example, would be Misty by Errol Garner, probably one of the most popular classic jazz ballads that even non-musicians know about. A tune like Darn That Dream is a really good one to learn, or even more complicated ones like Body and Soul and Stella by Starlight are great ones to learn, but there's almost too many to name. So definitely do some research and learn the ones that you really like. By the way, if you need help learning jazz standards, actually we learn a new jazz standard every single month in our Learn Jazz Standards Inner Circle membership, and we do it with a community of over 1,800 other musicians playing all sorts of instruments. We have a lot of fun and we make it really easy to do. So check it out in the link down below, or we have it up here on the screen if you're interested in the Inner Circle. Now, perhaps you know some of these tunes, or you're just wondering, Brent, How do I actually go about improvising over top of these jazz standards? Well, I have a video on the screen right now called Jazz Improv Explained. I really break it down to the most simple of terms of how to get started improvising with jazz, so click on that video right now. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.